Good morning from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, where we are on air with a specially extended news bulletin. We'll stay on air, if we can, for an hour and bring you Boris Johnson's statement as it happens. This is now a city at war after a Russian assault which was both sudden and rapid. Thousands of troops, backed by tanks and missile fire, have crossed the border into Ukraine on every front. Explosions heard here in the capital, Kyiv, and other major cities across this country. As we speak, there are reports that Russian tanks have already entered Ukraine's second-largest city of Kyiv. Ukraine's president has urged citizens to come to the defense of their country, while in the face of an international outcry, there was an ominous warning from President Putin. Any attempt, he said, to interfere would lead to consequences as you've never seen them before.
Кто бы ни пытался помешать нам, а тем более создать угрозы для нашей страны, для нашего народа, должны знать, что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались.
President Putin did not pick up the phone to President Zelensky, by the way, overnight, but an exhausted-looking President Zelensky of Ukraine addressed his people, the Ukrainian people, a few hours ago.
Україна захищається і не віддасть своєї свободи, щоб там не думали в Москві.
So, in the early hours of this morning, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, firing missiles at key military infrastructure sites, with explosions reported in major cities, including, of course, the capital, Kyiv. Other cities that have been targeted include Odessa, the major port on the Black Sea, Mariupol, which is located close to Russian-occupied territory, but also towns like Lutsk in the west of Ukraine, showing the breadth of the assault from Russian forces. Ukraine claimed that 50 Russians have been killed on the Eastern Front and said 3 Russian helicopters have been shot down. The Kyiv government has promised weapons to anyone who is willing to defend the country. Civilian flights have been suspended, with Ukrainian airspace declared an active conflict zone, while world leaders have denounced Russia's actions. President Biden warning it could bring a catastrophic loss of human life and, of course, suffering. The dawn chorus that no one wants to hear. Air raid sirens in Kyiv signaling that the full-scale invasion of a European country had started a few hours earlier. This capital city of 3 million people is now under siege by the Russian army. It had been a dire prediction met with incredulity. Now it is reality. Dnipro in the east, on the horizon a big explosion. The woman who took the picture swears and then sighs. In the southeast, this was the smouldering wreckage of Mariupol airport. But also in the west of Ukraine, this was an airstrike near Lviv, close to the Polish border. And this was Kyiv's main commercial international airport, its window on the world, now a ball of fire. The picture is as fragmented and alarming as this artillery fire on the horizon near Kharkiv, all triggered by its architect in a televised address at 4 a.m.
Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима. Призываю вас немедленно сложить оружие и идти домой. Поясню. Все военнослужащие украинской армии, которые выполнят это требование, смогут беспрепятственно покинуть зону боевых действий и вернуться к своим семьям. Кто бы ни пытался помешать нам, а тем более создать угрозы для нашей страны, для нашего народа, должны знать, что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались. Мы готовы к любому развитию событий.
Denazification, demilitarization of Ukraine, the first based on a lie, the second a euphemism for invasion. Metadata analysis indicates that these words were actually recorded on Monday evening, when Vladimir Putin gave his rambling justification for what is now unfolding before the world's blinking eyes. Back in Kyiv, an unshaven and distraught-looking President Zelensky addressed his people for the second time in 5 hours.
Ми розірвали дипломатичні відносини з Росією. Україна захищається і не віддасть своєї свободи, щоб там не думали в Москві. Росія підло і самовбивче напала рано вранці на нашу державу. Так само, як це зробила фашистська Німеччина у роки Другої світової війни. Це вже наша вся
He appealed to their
багатомільйонна
courage,
армія.
summoning the millions of citizen defenders. But the streets out of the capital were congested with the rush hour of war. Heading west to supposed safety. Kyiv is a city of glaring absences this morning. Those who did venture out were hunting for basics like food, reliable information, or cash.
We want to escape, but we don't know how. My father lives in other city, but war.
Bombing.
We will fight and protect.
You'll fight?
Yes. Yes.
You will fight?
Yes, of course.
When?
When our government will take
Give you the order.
decision, yeah.
So you're not going to leave Kyiv? You're not running away?
No. Categorically, no.
Will you fight? Will you fight?
I guess yes. It's my country. I was born here, so what can I do?
Imagine them up against the Russian army. The government here has just announced it'll hand out weapons to anyone prepared to fight. The mood is dazed, bewildered, anxious, wondering in vain if these angels of Maidan could work some protective magic. And as we look at the skyline of Kyiv, I just want to stress the following. Just a few days ago, the Russian government was swearing, was adamant that it was not planning any invasion at all. And yet we know from the analysis of metadata that rather chilling message recorded by Vladimir Putin overnight, the declaration of war, was recorded on Monday after his rambling speech. This thing has been in the pipeline, meticulously planned for days, and you could argue actually it's been planned for years, ever since Vladimir Putin invaded Crimea and occupied parts of eastern Ukraine. So this has been long in the coming, and yet it is still shocking to see it happening right now. And just a few minutes ago, by the way, there were some fighter jets crossing the horizon not too far from us. I'm assuming they were Ukrainian, but no one told us. We don't know that for certain, but that's certainly the hope. However, there's a report that the second wave of Russian missile attacks, not just here but across the country, is now underway. Again, we wait to see confirmation of that. Well, our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, is in Dnipro in eastern Ukraine. Lindsay, you've been on the road this morning. What have you seen?
Well, Matt, the first explosion that you showed in that story was here in Dnipro overnight. And yet right now it's completely calm. It feels rather surreal. I'm by the river Dnieper. There are ducks, there are children, there are people walking around as if nothing was happening. Now, we started the day further east in Kramatorsk. Now, Kramatorsk is about 50 miles from what was already Russian-controlled territory. Just after President Putin made his speech at 5 a.m. local time, we were woken by 4 explosions. My understanding is that these were missile attacks on the airport, which is southeast of Kramatorsk. We then got up and we moved to what we thought would be a safer place. When dawn rose, you know, again, it was very strangely normal. The bus was there. The only sign that something was amiss was the growing queues at the cash point machines. I spoke to one woman. She was very anxious. She said she worked in an orphanage and she was getting the bus to go to the orphanage. She was going to take the children somewhere safer. She wasn't clear where would be safer. We spoke to a man who was taking money out and he said, well, you know, I don't know where to go. I think I'll just have to stay here. We decided that we would move west, and so we drove. Now, that is because we were so near the area already controlled by the Russians, those separatist enclaves. It seemed that if the troops were to come in, they could arrive pretty quickly. We thought we were too near the front line. But, Matt, everywhere in Ukraine is a front line now.
Well, actually, it's funny what you should say. Well, it's not funny. It's poignant what you'd say, Lindsay, because we came across the same strange combination of nervousness, anxiety, but also a kind of serenity amongst some of the people that we saw this morning in Kyiv, a city that I have to say is a lot emptier now than it was in previous days. What are you hearing from elsewhere in the country?
Well, as we came, we saw a lot of petrol queues. People were obviously putting, gas in the tanks to go wherever they need to go. But some people can't move. In Kherson, that's a Ukrainian-controlled town down near Crimea. Crimea, which Russia has controlled since 2014. That, I understand, has seen some fighting. I think that there is some defense by the Ukrainians there. They're still in control of the city, but I think that that has been attacked quite severely. Up in Kyiv, which you mentioned, that's to the north, and that is really very near the border. I was there just a couple of weeks ago. What we are hearing from there is that there are Russian troops in tanks approaching. Some may actually be in the city already. So I think that is the main thing that we're hearing, that there is fighting in some places and Russians actually arriving. Mariupol, I'm jumping around geographically here, down by the Sea of Azov, not too far from Crimea. We understand that there has been fighting there, that there have been quite a lot of explosions. We know that there are Russian warships there. We don't know if there's going to be any kind of landing, but that again is another front. So that, I think, is what we're hearing. There are attacks from the air. There are attacks on the ground. There may be attacks from the sea. And I think all over Ukraine, people are just stunned, as they are all over the world. This is the 21st century. Nobody believed that this would happen like this. So many Ukrainians I've met in the last few weeks have been saying, yeah, well, he might do something bad. Maybe he's going to consolidate his hold over those, what they call separatist statelets in the east. Maybe he's going to try and move out a little. But Ukrainians just cannot believe that we have this all full-scale assault on a modern European country today in 2022.
Indeed, Lindsay. I think world leaders can't believe it either. There's a sort of general sense of incredulity, and perhaps it is the incredulity of this crisis in the face of Vladimir Putin's declared plans that was one of his strongest cards, despite the fact that we were constantly warned that this would be happening. Well, in the last few minutes, the Belarus leader, Alexander Lukashenko, has said that his troops are not involved in the Russian invasion, but said if it was necessary, well, they could be sent in. Let's go to Alexei Goncharenko. He's a Ukrainian member of parliament for the Black Sea port city of Odessa, one of the cities where Russian forces came through this morning. But he joins us now here from Kyiv. Alexei, it's great to speak to you again. What can you tell us, first of all, from the situation in Odessa? There were reports this morning that troops had come on shore there. Is that correct or not?
First of all, I'm in Kyiv, and I have information also just from my constituency, my voters. Yes, my voters, and there was no attack from the sea for the moment. There were bombing, there were missile attacks. And for example, on my constituency, there was a missile attack because of which 6 people were killed and almost 20 were lost. And we don't know their destiny for sure. So the Odessa was attacked by missile attacks, but not by the direct attack.
What is your overall assessment of where Vladimir Putin wants to head with this? Does he want to install a puppet regime in Kyiv? Does he want to occupy the entire country or just half a country? Where do you see this heading?
He's heading to Germany and Berlin, to 1989, to have a Berlin Wall and half of Europe under his control. Here in Ukraine, his aim is probably the puppet regime, like in Belarus, because Lukashenko is really the puppet regime today. So that can be his aim. And it's really a disaster, because thinking about that in 1994, we gave up our nuclear weapons under the ask of the United Kingdom, the United States and Russian Federation for non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. Now people are calling me and saying, if we would have a nuclear weapon, who would do this to us? And now we have bombing of our cities, killing of civilians. That's awful. And what is the message for the whole world of this? I just can't realize. So I would hope for very, very strong reaction from the world.
You gave up those nuclear weapons in 1994 because you were given security guarantees both by the Russians and by NATO.
Yes.
That must feel rather ironic at the moment.
It's very sad irony, very sad irony.
And do you think the Ukrainian army is able to resist the Russian forces in any shape or form? Because we heard President Zelensky just now, 2 hours ago, saying almost desperately, anyone who wants to fight, you can take a gun, we're going to throw open the armories. And then there's people that we spoke to on the street this morning, they all say, the men, we want to fight, some of the women too, but mainly the men say, we want to fight, but they've got no experience at all. This is not a match for the Russian army, is it?
Probably yes, but moral spirit, we hope for this. But definitely for Ukraine, it will be very hard times and days now. We can fight on the ground, but the problem is in the skies. If Russia will use their aircrafts, and they are using their aircrafts, just also for bombing civilian objects and military definitely too. That is in the middle of Europe in the 21st century. Maybe NATO can help us with non-flight zone like it was made in Syria, in Libya, and that can be a real support for Ukraine, not fighting for us on the ground, but just securing the skies of Ukraine.
The Pentagon released some information the other day saying that they are afraid that the Russian forces have drawn up kill lists of people that they want to target in the government, in the parliament, including people like you. Have you heard any reports of this? Are you taking any precautions?
I am in Kyiv, and I will not run from Kyiv. And my colleagues also. We had in the morning the extraordinary meeting of the parliament to support the president's decree on martial law, and we did it. Now we are looking forward for the next extraordinary meeting to adopt the law about general mobilization of Ukrainians. After this, probably the parliament would do whatever it could, and after this we can only fight. Yes, we understand that it was American intelligence who said that Russia already prepared the lists of people who will be killed, who will be tortured, and we see that Putin is real Hitler, so absolutely everything is possible if the world will not stop him.
When you think of the West's response to this, because we've been warned about Vladimir Putin's intentions for months now, when you think that the West thought it could deter him through targeted economic sanctions, severe ones, unprecedented perhaps in some cases, do you think that was a complete waste of time?
Yes, it was not probably. There was like a signal for Putin that further will be more stronger things. But now it's time for stronger things. What are these stronger things? That's a ban and embargo on Russian oil and gas. Just for people to understand, in each barrel of Russian oil, in each cubic meter of Russian gas, there is Ukrainian blood. It's bloody oil and bloody gas. And it should be stopped to go to Europe or whatever, to any other civilized country. And the second is a SWIFT system to stop connection of Russian financial system with the world's financial system. That's something which Putin will really feel.
Okay, Alexander Goncharenko, thank you very much indeed, and we wish you the best of luck. We'll hope to speak to you again soon. Let's go to Krish in London. Krish.
Thanks, Matt. In the last few minutes, we've been getting reports that Ukrainian authorities say there's been a large air assault operation involving Russian helicopters on the Antonov International Airport in Hostomel. This is about 12 to 15 miles from Kyiv. The Interior Ministry says Russia has seized control of that airport, and these pictures from the scene appear to show these large plumes of black smoke rising up into the sky with what are believed to be Russian helicopters making those attacks. Well, Boris Johnson described the Russian military action as a catastrophe for our continent, saying the UK would respond decisively. He will be making a televised address shortly. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Westminster. Gary.
Well, we'll be bringing you that statement when it happens, and I suspect the Prime Minister will be repeating that phrase, a catastrophe for the continent. A very loaded, heavy phrase, bracing people for the consequences of this conflict and all the time himself not really knowing what those consequences will be. I think we can definitely assume economic consequences, just as the world economy tries to recover post-COVID, and we can expect impact on prices and other things. Just to give you a sense of other bits of geography that are happening today in the timetable here, the Prime Minister is going to have a virtual conference with G7 leaders this afternoon. It's not that many years ago that was the G8. Russia was coming to those meetings. Now it's starting a conflict in Europe. He's going to do that address to the nation that you mentioned. The ambassador, the Russian ambassador to Britain, is being summoned to the Foreign Office for some stern words, though we don't get the impression at the moment that diplomatic relations are going to be broken. The sense is that channels like that might be useful and might be worth keeping open for the moment. I understand the Prime Minister wants a meeting of NATO to happen. The meeting that is happening later today in Brussels is of EU leaders. They're in an emergency summit, and what we're going to get later today from the Prime Minister about 5 o'clock, maybe later in the case of Europe, not sure what time in the case of Washington, is another set of coordinated sanctions against Russia. The Prime Minister came in for some criticism from his own MPs, from Labour MPs, and other parties were criticising him as well on Tuesday when he unveiled the first tranche, the first barrage, as he called it, of economic sanctions against Russia. And what is expected now is a tougher set of sanctions. We've had them already previewed, in a sense, access to financial markets being cut off for big players in the Russian economy, high-tech good export bans for Russia to endure, and that is meant to stop Russian growth in areas like exploration in the Arctic for new fuel supplies and the rest of it. But what Europe is not doing is turning around to Russia for all that talk of switching off Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline that is yet to be opened. It's not going to say to Russia, stop giving us the energy you're giving us already, because Europe in those recent years has become more and more dependent on Russian energy. The question is, will Russia itself try and squeeze the tap there, or will it just sit there counting the rubles as it makes more money as the price of fuel goes up?
Thanks, Gary, for now. We'll be back to you. Well, European leaders will meet later today at an emergency summit in Brussels, pledging a few moments ago to impose massive and severe consequences on Russia for its actions, while NATO has agreed to reinforce its air, land and sea forces along its eastern flank, denouncing what it called Russia's horrifying attack. Paul McNamara has the latest.
As US military might and support landed on Latvian soil, leaders of the West were woken in the dead of night to the news they all feared. The world had changed.
Good morning. Early this morning, Russian troops invaded Ukraine, a free and sovereign country. And once again, in the center of Europe, innocent women, men and children are dying of fear for their lives. We condemn this barbaric attack and the cynical arguments to justify it.
Just after dawn, the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, flanked by military advisers, arrived on Whitehall for an emergency Cobra meeting, a meeting chaired by the Prime Minister, who earlier tweeted, "I am appalled by the horrific events in Ukraine, and I have spoken to President Zelensky to discuss next steps." President Putin has chosen a path of bloodshed and destruction by launching this unprovoked attack on Ukraine. The UK and our allies will respond decisively. That response set to include increased and severe sanctions, a message echoed across Europe and the world, said the German Foreign Minister.
We will coordinate today with the EU, within NATO, within the G7. We will launch the full package with the most massive sanctions against Russia, and we will strengthen our security and our allies.
There was a coordinated condemnation from Eastern European nations Latvia, Lithuania and Poland, according to the Estonian Prime Minister, saying Russia's widespread aggression is a threat to the entire world and to all NATO countries, adding a plea to the West: the most effective response to Russia's aggression is unity. But though the action so far might be physical and local to Ukraine, Parliament was told preparation was made for warfare both technological and widespread to the west.
On this specific issue around cyber, as I said at the start, we will set out further details of the work that the Cabinet Office is doing. We had a COBRA this morning. That was one of the topics that was focused on.
The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has summoned the Russian ambassador to explain Russia's actions, and NATO has agreed to emergency talks today to strengthen defences in Eastern Europe, a Europe in its most perilous state for generations.
And Paul McNamara is with me now here in the studio. What's going on in the markets?
Well, this is where we've seen the biggest reaction today, and that reaction is a big red button being hit full of panic. So Asian markets have been down overnight. All European markets have been down on opening, but then they've continued to fall. So the FTSE's down about 3% at the moment. Germany's down about 4.5% because that's more exposed to Russia. And of course, the biggest reaction in Moscow itself. When the bombs started raining down in Ukraine, trading was stopped in Moscow. When it reopened, all of a sudden, the shares plummeted 45%. That's monumental. You don't see that. That is half the value of the stock market just being wiped off in one fell swoop. The ruble is down at its lowest in history against the dollar. And of course, the biggest reaction that we've seen isn't so much on stocks, but it's on commodities. So oil is up at $104 a barrel, past $100 for the first time in 8 years. Get this, gas is up 28%. What this means for you and me and all our viewers is that energy bills, in what is already a cost of living crisis,
already going up massively.
This is going to be huge. Inflation is already predicted at 7 or 8%. It's going to go much higher. Essentially, what's happening here isn't just some war that's 3.5 hours away and affecting lots of people we don't know. This war is going to affect everyone.
OK, thanks for now, Paul. Let me bring in our correspondent, Jonathan Rugman. What do you think is actually going on here in terms of the invasion and what Putin is doing?
Well, I think you've got two narratives from Moscow. You had the Ministry of Defense spokesman saying this was a special operation to protect the areas of Luhansk and Donetsk. And then you've got Vladimir Putin himself, who's the only person who really counts, saying this is about the denazification of Ukraine. The important fact to stress is that these Russian tanks are not stopping at these separatist areas. They are going for broke, from what we can tell. And my best guess, and the guess of one of your guests earlier, is that the Russian president wants to set up a puppet regime in Kyiv. He doesn't want to recreate the Soviet Union. It's too late for that. But what he does want to do is to have a satellite state on his doorstep in the same way that he has with Belarus and Alexander Lukashenko there. There is no question that the Russians have massive military superiority. They have 150,000 troops on that border versus 125,000 from the Ukrainians. The Russians have over 1,000 combat aircraft. The Ukrainians have 124. So the question is Vladimir Putin right? Is this a country that doesn't really exist? Or is it actually going to stand up and fight? Is it going to wage some kind of urban guerrilla warfare? Because in conventional terms, it really doesn't stand a chance.
Thank you for now. Jonathan, let me go now to a guest joining us, General Lord Dannatt, former head of the British Army. Lord Dannatt, what's your initial reaction to what's happening, first of all?
Well, my reaction is very clear that, by all accounts, Russia has done exactly what we did not want her to do. She has crossed a line in that she's now made significant armoured incursions into Ukraine. It's not entirely clear, and your last correspondent was backing up that lack of clarity, whether these incursions are just into the disputed eastern republics or whether they are more widely into Ukraine proper. My understanding from other reports is it's the latter, and the incursion is much more widely into Ukraine. But the fundamental point is that Putin, when he spoke so arrogantly at 6 a.m. Russian time this morning to his own people, was, as far as I was concerned, was sealing his own death knell, because he's done exactly what we hoped he wouldn't do. And the West must now speak very loudly, very clearly, with one voice, bringing unqualified condemnation onto him and Russia, imposing the maximum number of sanctions possible, isolating Russia from all further diplomatic and international activity. And he's got to be made to pay for this violation of international law and violation of Ukraine's sovereign territory.
What about the military picture on the ground? And it's worth saying, in response to the question of how far Russian forces are going, we do have these pictures that we've just been playing of what appear to be Russian helicopters going to the international airport about 20 kilometers away from Kyiv. And there are reports that, that Russian forces have taken control of that airport, though that's unconfirmed at the moment. But in terms of the fight, this is essentially their fight, is Britain's position, isn't it?
Well, we said that all along. The significant point, which I think everyone is very clear about, is that Ukraine, unlike the other former Eastern communist countries, Ukraine is not a NATO member, and therefore it is their fight, and we are supporting them in that fight with military equipment previously, with diplomatic support, and undoubtedly with significant economic sanctions to follow. Yes, we are supporting them in this fight, but it is their fight. I have some concern that I don't believe that in all the information and misinformation that's gone on in the last few days, despite the rhetoric coming from the Ukrainian government, that they've sufficiently mobilized and prepared their regular armed forces to take up proper defensive positions to really stand properly against the Russian incursion. So this fight may not be the bloody fair fight, if you like, that we've perhaps been expecting. We may well see that the Russians move quite quickly and successfully, but even if that is the case, that should not in any sense diminish the outrage from the West, the strength and determination of the West to exact huge price from Putin and Russia for this blatant violation of international law and bringing state-on-state conflict in a very old-fashioned way into Europe in the 21st century. It is not acceptable in any shape or form.
Lord Dannett, thank you. If you would stay with us for a moment, I just want to bring in Sir Tony Brenton, former British ambassador to Russia. Tony Brenton, does Putin care about sanctions? Will sanctions have any effect?
No, he doesn't. He cares much more about Russian national security, and that's what he thinks he's protecting in this case. So, well, I agree with Lord Dannett that this is entirely to be condemned, and, you know, we should do everything we can to condemn it and sanction him. In practice, we need to resign ourselves to the fact that that is not going to make any difference to the events now unrolling on the ground in Ukraine.
What would?
Well, what will is military events on the ground, which Lord Dannett is much better qualified than I am to comment on. Just watching the streams so far, it seems pretty clear they're being attacked from 4 directions. It seems pretty clear that they intend to dominate Ukraine as an initial phase. The interesting question for me as a non-military person, as a diplomat, is where they go from there. Because I should add this, one key lesson from today's events is that you take Putin seriously. You should listen to what he says and believe it. And what he says is that he wants to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Now, that is a major political objective, which would require, I suspect, at the least a change of Ukrainian government, and probably a bit more than that. I don't suppose he wants to remain in permanent occupation of Ukraine, although I wouldn't rule it out, but he's got a bigger political objective there, which is going to require military dominance in Ukraine, and that is what we have to face up to. Alternatively, he could, of course, lose, in which case he's got real problems at home.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much indeed. I'm just going to pause this discussion because the Prime Minister is due to make a televised address very shortly, and I think we can go back to Kyiv and Matt Fry. Matt.
Well, Christian, you can hear the bells of St. Michael's there. It is now 2 o'clock in the afternoon here in Kyiv. Kyiv under siege. It is noon in London. Let's see what Boris Johnson had to say about this crisis. Not quite yet? No? Okay. All right. So we're going to hear that statement in a second. You can hear the bells of St. Michael's Cathedral. The city of Kyiv is eerily calm, actually, even though there are reports of one airport destroyed, another airport under siege, and Russian troops and tanks on their way to the city. It feels, frankly, extraordinary to be in a city, a capital city, in Europe, of 3 million people, many of whom have fled, under siege from the Russian army. Let's listen to the Prime Minister's statement right now from Downing Street.
Shortly after 4 o'clock this morning, I spoke to President Zelensky of Ukraine to offer the continued support of the UK, because our worst fears have now come true and all our warnings have proved tragically accurate. President Putin of Russia has unleashed war in our European continent. He's attacked a friendly country without any provocation and without any credible excuse. Innumerable missiles and bombs have been raining down on an entirely innocent population. A vast invasion is underway, by land, by sea, and by air. And this is not in the infamous phrase, some faraway country of which we know little. We have Ukrainian friends in this country, neighbours, co-workers. Ukraine is a country that for decades has enjoyed freedom and democracy and the right to choose its own destiny. We and the world cannot allow that freedom just to be snuffed out. We cannot and will not just look away. It's because we've been so alarmed in recent months at Russian intimidation that the UK became one of the first countries in Europe to send defensive weaponry to help the Ukrainians. Other allies have now done the same, and we will do what more we can in the days ahead. Today, in concert with our allies, we will agree a massive package of economic sanctions designed in time to hobble the Russian economy. And to that end, we must also collectively cease the dependence on Russian oil and gas that for too long has given Putin his grip on Western politics. Our mission is clear. Diplomatically, politically, economically, and eventually militarily, this hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure. And so I say to the people of Russia, whose president has just authorized a tidal wave of violence against a fellow Slavic people, as the parents of Russian soldiers who will lose their lives, I cannot believe this is being done in your name, or that you really want the pariah status it will bring to the Putin regime. And I say to the Ukrainians in this moment of agony, we are with you. We're praying for you and your families, and we are on your side. And if the months ahead are grim and the flame of freedom burns low, I know that it will blaze bright again in Ukraine, because for all his bombs and tanks and missiles, I don't believe that the Russian dictator will ever subdue the national feeling of the Ukrainians and their passionate belief that their country should be free. I say to the British people and all who have heard the threats from Putin against those who stand with Ukraine, we will of course do everything to keep our country safe. We're joined in our outrage by friends and allies around the world. We will work with them for however long it takes to ensure that the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine is restored. Because this act of wanton and reckless aggression is an attack not just on Ukraine, on democracy, freedom in Eastern Europe and around the world. This crisis is about the right of a free, sovereign, independent European people to choose their own future. And that is a right that the UK will always defend.
That's Boris Johnson's address to the nation. Let's get a brief reaction to that from our two guests, Lord Dannatt and Sir Tony Brenton. Lord Dannatt, does the Prime Minister have the authority he needs to make that kind of statement right now?
Yes, I believe he does. He is the Prime Minister of this country, and I'm actually very heartened to hear his determined words. Now, determined words are one thing, but what they've got to be backed up by is a whole raft of economic sanctions. And I know there's a view about the effectiveness, or mixed views about the effectiveness of sanctions. They will not change things as far as Russia is concerned overnight, but over time they will become cumulative, and the pressure will build on Russia and on the Russian economy. And the isolation that has got to be brought to Russia in diplomatic terms is all critical. What actually happens in Ukraine is down to the Ukrainians' will to fight. But I'm very pleased to hear Boris Johnson speaking in the way that he has, in a very determined fashion.
Lord Dannatt, thank you very much indeed. So, Tony, what do you make of what you just heard?
Well, obviously, the moral force of what Boris has just said is right. But I'm afraid, as usual with Boris, he's overstated our ability to actually affect what's going on. It's not just me who doesn't believe that economic sanctions don't work. The Russians don't, and an awful lot of other people do too. Condemnation will come, of course, but the reality is that Putin has decided to apparently occupy all of Ukraine, is going to succeed in doing so unless the Ukrainians defeat him on the ground. And at that point, he is going to impose a political settlement, I assume, on Ukraine. And that is a reality that we're going to have to live with. The economic sanctions may have some effect down the track, but actually, by then, with an expanded in political influence Russia, with a helpful China from their point of view, with a Russian already capacity to handle economic sanctions following the whole bunch we imposed after 2014, I wouldn't rely on them to change the situation very much. So sadly, we are living now with a Russia which is willing to do this, and that is a reality we're going to have to adapt to.
So, Tony Brenton, thank you very much.
Well, now, Ukrainian Member of Parliament Solomia Borobrovska is Secretary for the Foreign Affairs Committee here and Deputy Head of the Ukrainian delegation in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. She was also the youngest acting governor in Ukraine's history as the governor for the Black Sea port city of Odessa, where Russian forces apparently came through this morning. She joins me now also from Kyiv. Thank you very much for coming on the programme in these rather difficult times. Tell me, when you look at the situation at the moment, when you look at the troops surrounding your country, encroaching on your capital and other cities, are you now seeing the end of Ukraine as we know it? Is this the end of Ukraine as an independent, sovereign, democratic state?
No, I can't say so. And I see not just only surrounding the borders, they're crossing the borders, and actually they started the war and the invasion. But the point is that the Ukrainians are giving fight, and I truly understand that the Kyiv will be the next, can be the next actually stop by their military forces, and they want us to capitulate at the states. They want to hear from Zelensky that we will say no to NATO, and we will recognize Crimea as a part of Russia and the so-called republics. But I cannot believe this can ever happen with even with our lost. All MPs, almost all MPs, are staying in Kyiv, ready to vote if it's necessary. We are waiting for our head of faction from the meeting with the president. And again, no, I can't imagine that we'll get new Ukraine in almost the heart of the Europe, with a new history and with the new part of new Soviet, someone's wish to rebuild Soviet Union.
Right, but let's be honest here. I know it sounds depressing. You're not going to win this fight against the Russian army, are you? You just can't. They're too mighty. They're too powerful for you.
And we cannot recognize that the Crimea is a part of the Russian Federation, or we cannot recognize so-called republics being in the sovereign states. That's ridiculous, actually, and we are losing the whole international law. And if you're ready, and if our international partners are ready just to give up us immediately, I think that's incredible. The next will be not Ukraine, but Poland and Baltic states, and they truly understand what's going on, and that they will be the next.
So you're convinced that Vladimir Putin will not stop at the border between Ukraine and Poland?
Yeah, of course, for sure. He will not. And I think that his thesis in his speeches, always he's stressing, especially on the Baltic countries and Poland. And that's why actually it's possible to explain why their presidents and their governments are so really worrying and helping us so much. They know how to pass the Soviet regime, and that's the part of the Soviet occupation and the Soviet dreams from which Putin will never decline. We have to be honest with that. He likes history, he likes the fakes in history, and he will build these new fakes, not only with Ukraine, but with the next steps, unfortunately, that's next countries, unfortunately.
So how does the future of your country, how does the future of your people, your future look in the next few months and years?
I think we can get these answers very soon. Fortunately or unfortunately, we'll see what will be going on with the Ukrainian armed forces, and I stay on behind them, and I keep going to support them and to trust them what they are doing now, especially in Odessa, in Kherson, in Chernihiv Oblast, in Zhytomyr Oblast on the borderlines, and so on. And I want to believe if we have to fight, we will fight for sure. And that's an example of lots of civilians who are now staying on the lines to the territorial defense. And actually, after this, my brief interview, I'll go to get a weapon as well, and I will continue to stay here to fight.
Right. Just finally and briefly, are you angry with NATO? Are you angry with the West that they've offered you, above all, some very robust rhetoric, and in some cases also weapons, but not really the kind of defense that you thought you were getting when you gave up your nuclear weapons in 1994?
I'm angry with the NATO decision 2008 that they didn't allow us to join at that time, and we had to pass through 15 years. I do understand that we have lots of domestic tasks to do, and we have the real Russian regime since 2010 till 2013, up till our revolution of dignity. But what I see now, we passed a lot after these 8 years, and our interoperability with the military forces of NATO countries are really high. And I do not understand why the Western world are not going and staying behind now, especially when Putin actually said we are going to have war in the central of Europe with Ukraine, just like he likes at 5 p.m. So I think yes, I have angriness for that, but we do understand that no one will fight for our state. That's our deal. And this know each country who passed the Russian occupation.
Okay. Samina Bobrovska, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and stay safe. Well, I'm now joined by the Labour Shadow Minister, Emily Thornberry, and by Tobias Ellwood, MP, who's the chairman of the Commons Defence Committee, of course. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, Tobias Ellwood. You were one of the few members of Parliament who were very clear about the consequences of this and the unfolding of this. When you look at the situation today, what do you tell yourself, other than I was right?
Yeah, it's a very sad moment that we've not kept ahead of events. We've followed Putin. We've reacted to what he's doing. We've never got ahead of it. You know, we tried the diplomatic channels. That didn't work. We've tried sanctions. That's also failed as well. And I think the biggest frustration is that we've benched our most potent asset, and that's the military alliance of NATO. It is a deterrence. It's there to deter. And 6 months ago, we should have used that deterrence, and I think it would have prevented an invasion today. But even now, we need to take stock of what we can do to help the Ukrainians. And NATO has a role to play there in providing weapon systems, providing that support. We've moved into a new era of this crisis, and we need to be much more front-footed.
We'll get on to the military side of things in a minute, but I just want to know from you first, Tobias, and then also from Emily Thornberry. I mean, we've been talking about Russian sanctions for a long time. Frankly, the sanctions imposed after 2014 were pretty pathetic. Even the sanctions announced earlier this week were seen as rather mild, considering the gravity of the situation. Chris Bryant has just stood up in the House of Commons and called for Roman Abramovich to be stripped of the ownership of Chelsea Football Club. Your comment, please. First to you, Tobias.
Well, I don't believe sanctions were working at all from the very start. Putin has built in, he's factored in Western reaction here. He's tilting his nation towards China. So any sanctions that are introduced actually just encourage him to take his nation further in that direction. As a leverage, it's not been successful in the past. In other nations, it actually encourages the people of that country to rally around their leader. This is all very too late in the day. It's not going to influence events here. And the idea that we had an incremental approach to introducing sanctions, if there's a full invasion, well then we will then introduce more sanctions, as if somehow the tanks would turn around and go home. You know, we have not appraised ourselves. Our foreign policy, our strategy here is not working.
All right, let's hear it from Emily Thornberry then.
I've just come from the Shadow Cabinet, where we are completely united in our condemnation of what Russia has just done. And we stand full square behind the Ukrainian people. And what we're hoping is that the government will come forward today and put forward the full panoply of sanctions that are now available to it. They have not been doing that until now, but we've had several months in which the intelligence agencies from around the world in the West have been able to make quite clear to leaders what the Russians were likely to be doing, and so they've had time to plan. What we need to do is we need to work in conjunction with other Western allies, and in particular with NATO. But today we are expecting the government to play its part in introducing full-strength sanctions and not the minimal ones, which I agree with Tobias. They have been minimal until now.
I know, but it's a bit late in the day, isn't it, Emily Thornberry? This should have been done months ago. I mean, you could argue it should have been done years ago. But Labour and Tory governments over the years have facilitated the laundering of Russian money in London.
No, and I hear you. And I think what we'll do is we'll look back, in history. When 2019 is historical, and we'll see, what happened at Salisbury, I think was an alarm bell for everyone. We started to talk about introducing the new modern sanctions, including, the Magnitsky sanctions, which Labour suggested in the first place. They're introduced, but then then somehow or other the foot was taken off the gas at around 2019. And they were not being used in the way that they should have been. And yes, we should have been much tougher on Russian money over the last decade, but we haven't been. But now is an opportunity to do something, and I do expect the British government to play its full part. So there will be a range of sanctions. There will be sanctions that can be taken out against the Russian economy, but there are also individual sanctions which Britain will have a major part to play in, given the amount of individual Russian money, much of which is Putin's and comes from Putin's friends, and they're holding it for him in London Grad, which is what is now London is now called. A lot of it is now in Knightsbridge. The Americans have said that a lot of Putin's money is already.
But he doesn't care about the economy. We know this. Sorry to interrupt, Emily Thornberry. He doesn't really care about the economy. He cares about his legacy. He's on a mission to reunify Greater Russia, the Russian Empire. He told us so on television on Monday. But just getting back to domestic British politics,
I mean, whilst
do you think Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the... Hang on a minute, let me just ask my question. Do you think Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour Party... Right, let me just ask you the question. Do you think Jeremy Corbyn, who was the leader of your party, should apologise for what many people thought was being far too understanding, as we say, of the regime of Vladimir Putin? Is it time for him to stand up and say, I got him wrong?
I think that anybody who had any misunderstandings about Putin and about his attitude to security and where he wanted Russia to go and what he wanted Russia to do, and anybody who's under any doubt at all will now hopefully be able to think again and be clear and understand clearly what Russian intentions are under Putin. And we need to, and I hope that people will be thinking again that, but I do think that what we should all be doing, and I would suggest that Tobias does this and a number of other people, I would respectfully say they take a leaf out of the official opposition's book, and that is to stand full square behind the government and the West in the action that will be taken in the next few weeks. And we need to make sure that we don't get ahead of ourselves, but that we implement full-strength sanctions, because I do believe it can have an effect if we all play our part.
Okay, okay, fine. Let's move on to Tobias Ellwood. Tobias, you're ex-military man. You've been engaged in the kind of strategic thinking about this for quite some time. What can actually happen now to keep these people relatively safe? Give them a helping hand. Is it a no-fly zone? And how would you enforce that?
Yes, I mean, these are all the sorts of things that we now need to start thinking about. Well, we shouldn't be started thinking about. We should have been thinking about them 6 months ago, because, as you touched on before and implied, I was predicting this was going to happen. We firstly need to take stock of wider European security. It's time to increase our defence spending to 3%. We need to recognise that we've entered a new era of instability, not just Russia itself, but other authoritarian regimes that will be watching very carefully what happens here, our international reaction. Yes, we're unified in our condemnation, but as I say, sanctions have a double-edged sword effect to them. I'm not sure it's going to influence Putin. You yourself indicated where Putin wants to go. We have failed to actually analyse what his long-term objectives is. When we do that, we're then in a better position to say how can we halt that, how can we challenge that direction. You mentioned no-fly zone. That is one example of a wide spectrum of options that is now open to NATO. But what we can't do is continue to bench NATO, park it to the side, and even tell our adversary that we're not going to utilise them in any form whatsoever. That's not the way you handle a dictator like Putin.
Well,
got to leave it there. Tobias Ellwood, Emily Thornberry, thank you very much to both of you for joining us here in London. I'm in Kyiv. Let's go to Krish. Krish.
Well done.
Let's get the latest from the United States now. Our reporter Kieran Moodley is in Washington. Kieran.
Well, Krish, last night events here unfolded quite quickly. Soon after Joe Biden announced his new sanctions, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, he went on television news and said, look, war is coming. We think it's going to happen very soon. And so there was a UN Security Council meeting, an 11th hour meeting, although it happened well before 11 p.m. And it seemed quite futile given that Russia had already decided to invade. Let's now hear what the UN Secretary General said in that meeting.
President Putin, in the name of humanity, bring your troops back to Russia. In the name of humanity, do not allow to start in Europe what could be the worst war since the beginning of the century.
We also saw an extraordinary intervention from the Ukrainian representative there, who sort of tore off his face mask, he stared down his Russian counterpart, he said, pick up the phone to Kremlin and stop this war. Let's hear that soundbite from him.
Well, as I said, relinquish your duties as a chair. Call Putin, call Lavrov to stop aggression. And I welcome the decision of some members of this council to meet as soon as possible to consider the necessary decision that would condemn the aggression that you launch on my people. There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell, Ambassador.
Joe Biden, he last night spoke with the Ukrainian President, Vladimir Zelensky. He also met with his military and his defence teams, and he will later speak with G7 leaders. He last night condemned what he called a premeditated war, and he said today he will announce further severe sanctions. But will they do anything? That's the big question, because the sanctions did not prevent Putin from going to war, and they don't seem as if they're going to stop him now. So all eyes are on a speech from Joe Biden at noon today. That's 5 p.m. UK time. He will announce new severe sanctions, but he won't obviously say that he will commit US troops into Ukraine. So we're waiting to see what exactly he's going to say and what exactly President Biden means when he says the world will hold Russia accountable.
Kieran Moodley in Washington. Let's go back to Westminster now and join our political editor, Gary Gibbon, with the latest. Gary.
Well, people have been digesting the Prime Minister's statement there, and there are quite a lot of messages in it. One of them was that he wanted the country, as some of your interviewees have been suggesting, to be braced for the long haul on this one. He also talked about how he wanted to reassure people that all who may have heard President Putin's threats to those countries that choose to help Ukraine, that we had allies, we had strength, not to be fearful of that. He said that there would be a continuation, he suggested, of allied efforts to send armaments over to Ukraine. Not entirely clear how they'll get there, depending on the course of this conflict. But he didn't strongly signal that he was going to move to any sort of military support. One prominent Tory backbencher, former cabinet minister David Davis, has piped up this morning saying that sanctions are a punishment, not a deterrent, and we need to move to military support, to air support for Ukraine. I'm not getting a sense yet that the government is thinking of that, but of course they're very conscious that things can escalate, spill over, and that's the greatest danger that they are concerned about in all of this. He also signalled that he very much wanted European countries to cease their dependence on Russian energy. Well, that's not something that can easily happen overnight, but it will mean, if it is going to happen, that Britain might have to supply stuff across pipelines through the North Sea. America might have to start supplying stuff, all sorts of big changes there. He warned that Russia was heading for pariah status, and that is one of the things that people talk about a lot in Whitehall, but fundamentally they are, when you talk to them, baffled about how President Putin sees the end game here. They think he would need forces way beyond comprehension to properly occupy Ukraine. They don't understand what he's doing, but they fear for it, and they think it will be with us for a long time.
Gary Gibbon in Downing Street. Matt.
Well, indeed, it will be with us for a long time. It is the complete restructuring, potentially, of the security architecture of what we got used to in Europe for the last 70 years. Quick reminder of our main and rather dramatic news today. Russia has launched an all-out attack on Ukraine. Russian helicopters have bombed an international airport on the outskirts of this capital, while tanks and thousands of troops have moved in from all sides, with explosions heard here in the capital, Kyiv, and indeed cities across the country, including the city of Dnipro and the second largest city of Ukraine, the city of Kyiv. Ukraine has called on all citizens to defend the country and also claimed that 50 Russian soldiers had been killed in the fighting on the eastern flank, as Western leaders united to condemn Moscow's aggression. Boris Johnson declared this hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure. That's all we have time for. We're back tonight at 7 o'clock, of course, here from Kyiv with a specially extended Channel 4 News. Goodbye.